What if the most awkward sound on a red carpet isn't silence, but a crowd deciding in real time that they're done playing along? Because that's the sound witnesses say cut through the cold Utah air that night. Not applause, not polite murmurs, something sharper, something unmistakable. Booing, loud, fragmented at first, then confident. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And the strangest part? This wasn't supposed to happen here. This was supposed to be safe territory. Friendly ground, a curated crowd, a celebration, a debut, a documentary premiere wrapped in purpose and prestige, cameras ready, smiles rehearsed, narratives preloaded. Instead, the moment cracked. Let's rewind. Slowly, because nothing about this night makes sense unless we do. Picture the scene. Snow-dusted sidewalks, branded lanyards bouncing against winter coats, indie filmmakers buzzing with caffeine and ambition, publicists scanning the perimeter like air traffic controllers. Sundance nights always feel charged, like everyone is on the brink of discovering something important, someone important. And then the convoy arrives, black vehicles, tinted windows, security moving first, scanning faces, reading the temperature of the crowd. Phones go up, camera shutters chatter. A ripple of recognition moves outward like a wave. This is the moment every celebrity arrival lives for. Except this time, the wave didn't lift. It stalled, and then, audibly, it turned. You might be wondering right now, are we exaggerating this? Was it just a few hecklers? A random bad apple? Or was it something more? That question is exactly why this story matters, because what happened next wasn't just about noise. It was about a shift, a mood, a public sentiment no longer whispering but speaking out loud, right there on one of the most symbolic stages in entertainment. And here's the thing nobody tells you about moments like this. You can feel them before you fully hear them. Witnesses describe a hesitation in the applause, a staggered rhythm, clapping that didn't quite sync up, smiles that landed a beat too late, that subtle instinct humans have when they sense a room is undecided. Have you ever walked into a space and instantly known you weren't welcome? Even before anyone said a word, that's the energy people say was hanging in the air. At first, it was deniable. A few boos could be dismissed as background noise. Protesters, maybe. A misunderstanding. Someone yelling something unintelligible. But then more voices joined. And that's when it crossed the line from awkward to undeniable. Because boos don't grow unless others feel permission to echo them. Ask yourself this: why would anyone boo at a documentary premiere? Especially one framed around empowerment, storytelling, and cultural relevance? That contradiction is the first crack in the night's carefully constructed image. This wasn't a tabloid event. This wasn't a chaotic street appearance. This was Sundance, a place that prides itself on social conscience, progressive ideals, and championing voices that challenge the establishment. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If even this audience pushed back, what does that say about the story being told? Or about the people telling it? The documentary itself, titled Cookie Queens, had been positioned as celebratory, purpose-driven. A continuation of a broader media narrative centered on voice, visibility, and impact. The rollout suggested confidence, assurance, the sense that the room would lean in, not pull away. And yet, as the crowd noise grew uneven, that confidence seemed to falter. Observers noted subtle details, a pause before waving, a glance sideways, a half-smile held a second too long. These are the micro-moments most viewers never see, but they matter, because public figures are trained for applause. They're trained for criticism too, but they're not trained for unpredictability. Unpredictability rattles even the most polished performance. Now, let's be clear about something before we go any further. Not everyone booed. That's important. There was applause, there were cheers, there were supporters filming proudly, posting excited clips, insisting the reception was warm. So which version is true? That's where this story starts to get complicated. Because multiple truths can exist at once, and the tension lives in the overlap. Some attendees described a split crowd, Others claimed the boos came from outside the main press pen. A few insisted it was exaggerated online. Meanwhile, others say the sound followed the group as they moved, rising and falling depending on where they stood. Here's the real question you should be asking yourself right now. Why are the accounts so inconsistent? When events go smoothly, narratives align. When something goes wrong, stories fracture. And fracture they did. Within minutes, social media lit up, not with celebration, but with debate. Clips surfaced from different angles. Audio quality varied. Captions contradicted one another. Some users swore they heard boos clearly. Others said they heard nothing but applause. So who do you believe? That uncertainty is the oxygen this moment feeds on. Because perception, not fact, is what shapes reputations. And perception was already fragile. For years, public appearances like this had followed a familiar script: controlled environments, sympathetic audiences, and media framing that emphasized intention over reaction. This night broke that pattern. And breaks matter. Think about it this way. If this had happened at a random event, it might have been dismissed. If it had happened years ago, it could have been reframed. But happening here, at Sundance, at this point in the narrative arc, it landed differently. It felt symbolic, almost cinematic. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. A documentary about voice premiering amid voices of dissent. A celebration of storytelling interrupted by a crowd refusing to stay quiet. You can't script that. And you definitely can't unhear it once it starts. Behind the scenes, tension reportedly spiked. Security adjusted positions. Handlers leaned in closer. The choreography of the red carpet tightened, movements becoming more efficient, less performative. That alone tells you something shifted. Because when everything is going according to plan, you linger, you wave, you engage, you bask. When it's not, you move. Quickly. But the most revealing moments didn't happen in front of the cameras. They happened in the gaps. Between interviews, between steps, between smiles. That's where witnesses say the real confusion set in. Not panic, yet, but recalculation. The kind that happens when expectations collide with reality and neither side wins cleanly. And here's a detail that keeps coming up from multiple accounts, despite their disagreements. No one seemed prepared for this reaction. Not emotionally, not strategically, which is strange, isn't it? Because in today's climate, backlash is rarely spontaneous. It's usually predicted, modeled, stress-tested, especially at this level. So why did this moment feel like it blindsided everyone involved? Was it misread sentiment? Overconfidence? Or something else entirely? Hold on to that question, because as the night continued, the public moment ended, but the private consequences were just beginning. And what happened next didn't unfold on the carpet. It unfolded off camera, in whispers, in hurried conversations, in phones lighting up with messages that weren't supposed to leak. Because while the crowd outside was making noise, something inside the room was quietly falling apart. And that's where this story truly begins. Did you notice how quickly everyone tried to move past it? That's always the tell, because when something truly doesn't matter, people don't rush to explain it away. They don't flood timelines with reassurance. They don't argue over what was or wasn't heard. They don't clip videos down to milliseconds and slow them, boost audio, add captions, remove captions, repost, delete, repost again. They shrug. This night did not get shrugged, which brings us back to that red carpet. Back to the moment after the first sound broke through the polite noise of cameras and chatter. Back to the second when uncertainty became tension. Here's what several attendees independently described. A pause that felt longer than it was. Not a dramatic stop, just a hesitation. The kind your body feels before your brain catches up. Applause, but uneven. Cheers, but scattered and threaded through it. Something sharper. Booing doesn't always announce itself clearly. It doesn't arrive like a chant. Sometimes it sneaks in as tone, as hostility disguised as humor, as heckling phrased just vaguely enough to dodge immediate confrontation. And that's what made this moment unsettling. Because some people didn't even register it at first. They felt it. The crowd's energy shifted from curious to critical, from observational to evaluative, as if the audience had collectively decided this wasn't a performance they were obligated to applaud. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you saw that happen at an elite film festival? Red carpets are rituals. Everyone knows their role. Celebrities smile, fans cheer, critics observe, publicists manage, security watches. It's a choreography designed to avoid friction, but choreography breaks when the music changes. And on this night, the music changed mid-step. What's fascinating and deeply uncomfortable is how fast that shift exposed the fragility of the moment. Because for all the planning, all the messaging, all the controlled environments, none of it can override a crowd that decides it no longer believes the story it's being sold. That's the part people don't want to talk about. Witnesses say the reactions didn't come from one obvious pocket. Not a protest group, not a cluster of hecklers waving signs. Instead, it felt dispersed. A sound here, another there, enough distance between voices to make it harder to pinpoint, harder to silence, harder to dismiss. That matters, because isolated hecklers can be removed. Diffuse dissent cannot, and suddenly, the cameras, those same cameras meant to immortalize a triumphant debut, became liabilities. You could see it in the way angles tightened, in how quickly interviews were redirected, in the subtle shift from openness to control. Have you ever watched someone realize, in real time, that they've lost the room? It doesn't look dramatic. It looks restrained. Smiles become thinner. Movements become economical. There's less engagement with the crowd, more reliance on handlers. Several people noticed the same thing. The wave didn't last long. Normally, red carpet waves are indulgent. They're generous. They say, "I belong here." This one felt brief. Almost like the goal became getting through the moment rather than savoring it. And again, ask yourself why. If this were nothing, why rush? If this were overblown, why not lean in harder, drown it out with confidence? That contradiction sits at the heart of the story, because the official framing that followed would later suggest everything was fine, that the reception was positive, that any negativity was exaggerated or malicious. But bodies don't lie the way press statements do. And the body language told a different story. One attendee described it like this: "It felt like when a joke doesn't land, but the person telling it keeps smiling anyway. That's not outrage, that's discomfort. And discomfort is harder to spin." Now, let's talk about the crowd itself, because who was there matters just as much as what they did. This wasn't a general audience. This wasn't random passers-by. This was a mix of industry insiders, aspiring filmmakers, journalists, volunteers, locals who've seen it all before, and festival regulars who pride themselves on authenticity over celebrity worship. In other words, this was not an audience inclined to clap just because they're supposed to. And that's where the miscalculation, if there was, one may have happened. Because Sundance crowds are famously skeptical. They reward sincerity. They punish perceived performativity. They love underdogs. They bristle at polish that feels prepackaged. So when something feels too curated, too rehearsed, too familiar, they notice. And sometimes they react. What did they react to here? That's the million-dollar question. Some say it was fatigue. Others say it was resentment. A few argue it was political. Others insist it was personal. But listen closely to how defenders and critics both frame it. One side says, it was only a few people. The other says, a few people don't change the atmosphere unless others agree. Both statements can be true. And that's what makes this moment so revealing. Because you don't need unanimous rejection to create a problem. You just need enough dissent to break the illusion of consensus. Once the illusion cracks, everything looks different. Suddenly, applause feels performative instead of genuine. Cheers feel defensive instead of celebratory. Silence feels loaded. And the silence that followed certain moments that night was heavy. There were gaps between reactions. Beats where the crowd didn't know how to respond. Those gaps were filled with nervous laughter, awkward clapping, people glancing at each other as if to ask, "Are we doing this?" That's not hostility. That's uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous for any public narrative built on confidence. Behind the scenes, that uncertainty reportedly triggered a cascade of micro-decisions, adjusting schedules, shortening interactions, limiting exposure. None of this was announced. None of it needed to be, because when something goes off script, the response isn't dramatic, it's procedural. And procedure is where truth often hides. What's striking is how quickly the tone online diverged from the tone on the ground. Within hours, headlines began smoothing edges. Words like mixed reaction replaced harsher descriptions. Emphasis shifted to the documentary itself rather than the reception. That's not unusual. What is unusual is how hard people pushed back. Clips circulated showing audible boos. Others showed only cheers. Comment sections erupted into arguments not about the film, but about whether the reaction even happened. That tells you something important. When the debate becomes about reality itself, trust has already eroded. And trust is the currency of storytelling. This wasn't just about a red carpet moment. It was about credibility, about whether audiences still felt aligned with the story being presented to them. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. People don't boo narratives they believe in. They boo ones they're tired of, or ones they feel excluded from, or ones they suspect are incomplete. Which one applies here? That's what everyone is trying to figure out. As the night moved on, the immediate spectacle faded. The carpet cleared. The crowd dispersed. But the tension didn't dissipate. It followed them inside. And that's where accounts become even more fragmented. Some say the reception indoors was warm. Others describe a polite but restrained atmosphere. A few insist there was enthusiasm. A few more say it felt forced. Again, fracture. And fracture is where deeper stories live. Because if this were truly a non-event, there wouldn't be so many versions of it. There wouldn't be so much effort to control which version sticks. The red carpet is supposed to be the easy part. It's the public-facing ritual designed to reassure everyone involved that things are going according to plan. When the easy part goes sideways, it raises uncomfortable questions about the harder parts still to come. Questions like, how will this play elsewhere? Was this an outlier or a preview? And perhaps most importantly, what did the people involved realize in that moment that the rest of us haven't fully caught up to yet? Because witnesses agree on one thing, even when they disagree on everything else. Something shifted that night. Not loudly, not definitively, but enough to be felt. And once a shift is felt, it can't be unfelt. As the lights dimmed and attention turned toward the screening itself, a new tension settled in. Not anticipation, not excitement. Expectation. The kind that waits to see whether the story on screen can repair what the moment outside had damaged. And that's where the stakes quietly doubled. Because if the red carpet reaction was the warning shot, what happened next would determine whether this night would be remembered as a glitch, or as the moment everything changed. Who exactly was standing there when the noise broke through? Because once you ask that question, the story stops being about sound and starts being about power. This is where a lot of people get uncomfortable. They prefer to imagine boos as coming from the margins, from outsiders, from people who don't belong in the space. It's comforting. It preserves the idea that elite rooms are insulated from dissent. But Sundance doesn't work that way, and that's why this moment landed differently. The crowd that gathers at a major film festival isn't random. It's layered, tiered, fragmented in ways most casual viewers don't see. There are filmmakers who scrape together funding and are running on hope and caffeine. There are critics whose opinions can shape careers. There are industry veterans who've watched. Go. Who exactly was standing there when the noise broke through? Because once you ask that question, the story stops being about sound and starts being about power. This is where a lot of people get uncomfortable. They prefer to imagine boos as coming from the margins, from outsiders, from people who don't belong in the space. It's comforting. It preserves the illusion that elite rooms are sealed, that influence flows only one way, that dissent is always external. But Sundance doesn't work like that. And that's precisely why this moment mattered. The crowd at a major film festival isn't a single audience. It's a layered ecosystem, a living hierarchy where everyone is watching everyone else. Filmmakers gauging critics, critics gauging trends, industry veterans gauging which way the cultural wind is blowing, volunteers gauging whether they're witnessing history or a misfire, locals gauging whether the spectacle still feels authentic or just imported. So when the sound shifted on that carpet, it wasn't just noise, it was signal. Let's break that down. At the front, closest to the barricades, you usually have a mix of credentialed press and festival regulars. These aren't starstruck tourists. These are people who've seen celebrities up close year after year. They clap when they're impressed. They don't clap when they're not. Indifference is their default setting. A few steps back, you get aspiring filmmakers, writers, editors, people trying to break in. They're paying attention differently. They're scanning for cues. Who gets treated like royalty? Who gets rushed through? Who gets time? And who doesn't? Then there are the locals, Park City residents who've watched Sundance evolve, commercialize, and rebrand itself over decades. They've seen earnest indie debuts. They've seen glossy celebrity vehicles. They know the difference, and they're not shy about having opinions. Finally, there are the activists, the idealists, the people who show up because Sundance used to stand for something specific, something raw, something unpolished, something that challenged power rather than performed it. Now ask yourself, which of these groups would be most likely to boo? The answer isn't obvious, and that's the point, because the reaction that night didn't feel contained to one category. It felt dispersed, diffuse, almost democratic in its unpredictability. That's why security couldn't just zero in on a single source. That's why the noise felt harder to control. It wasn't coming from one corner. It was popping up, fading, reappearing. That kind of reaction only happens when people feel safe enough to express it. And safety in this context doesn't mean physical safety. It means cultural permission. Someone breaks the silence. Others realize they're not alone. And suddenly, the room recalibrates. Have you ever been in a meeting where one person finally says what everyone else has been thinking, and the entire dynamic changes? That's what this felt like. Not rage, not chaos, release, which raises an uncomfortable question. What had been building up before this moment? Because reactions like this don't usually come out of nowhere. They're often the visible tip of something that's been quietly accumulating beneath the surface. Some attendees later said the mood had been skeptical even before the arrival, that conversations in lines, lounges, and shuttle buses had already turned critical, that people were questioning the choice of project, the platform, the framing. Nothing loud, nothing confrontational, just doubt. And doubt is contagious. What's particularly telling is that many of the people present weren't hostile. They weren't shouting insults. They weren't holding signs. They weren't staging a protest. They were doing something far more damaging to a carefully managed narrative. They were withholding approval, and occasionally, audibly so. That's the thing about elite cultural spaces. Silence can be weaponized just as effectively as noise, but when silence breaks into sound, even briefly, it carries more weight than 1,000 think pieces. One longtime festival volunteer described it this way. It didn't feel angry. It felt tired. That word keeps coming up. Tired. Not outraged. Not scandalized. Tired. Tired of repetition. Tired of feeling talked at. Tired of narratives that feel sealed off from critique. Tired of being expected to respond with automatic reverence. And when fatigue reaches a tipping point, politeness becomes optional. Now, here's where the contradictions start to matter, because for every person who says the crowd was hostile, there's another who insists it was supportive. For every clip that amplifies boos, there's another that captures cheers. So which is true? Both. And that's what makes this moment so volatile, because divided reactions don't cancel each other out. They amplify tension. Applause and boos colliding in the same space create friction. And friction is what turns a routine appearance into a story. If everyone had booed, it would have been written off as backlash. If everyone had cheered, it would have been written off as success. But this limbo, this ambiguity, that's where narratives go to war. And you can see that war play out in real time when you watch how people describe where they were standing. Those closer to the barricades tend to report clearer boos. Those further back report confusion. Those watching live streams report inconsistent audio. Each perspective is true to the position it occupies, and each position comes with its own interests. Think about that. Where you stand literally shapes what you hear, and metaphorically shapes what you believe, which brings us to the next uncomfortable layer: hierarchy. In rooms like this, not all reactions are equal. A cheer from a random attendee doesn't carry the same weight as a sigh from a respected critic. A boo from a nobody doesn't matter as much as a raised eyebrow from someone whose opinion travels quietly through the industry. And while the boos grabbed headlines, it was the subtler reactions that insiders paid attention to. The lack of enthusiasm from certain quarters, the absence of buzz in spaces where buzz is currency, the way conversations pivoted away rather than leaning in. One industry observer put it bluntly: nobody was rushing to defend it in private. That matters, because public narratives can be managed. Private sentiment is harder to control. And Sundance is notorious for that gap. Deals live or die, not on applause, but on hallway conversations, on what people say when the cameras are gone and the badges come off. So while the public debate fixated on whether booing happened, insiders were already asking a different question. Why now? Why here? Why this project? Timing is everything in cultural moments. And timing, according to several people present, felt off. There's a sense among festival regulars that the industry is in a recalibration phase. Audiences are more skeptical. Institutions are being questioned. Celebrity narratives are being interrogated rather than embraced. In that environment, polished messaging can feel like insulation rather than transparency. And insulation breeds suspicion. Some attendees described feeling like they were being asked to validate a story rather than experience it, to applaud a conclusion rather than engage with a question. That's a dangerous ask in a space built on inquiry. And when people feel cornered into affirmation, resistance is often the response. Now, pause for a second and ask yourself something honestly. If you were standing there, surrounded by peers, aware of the cultural moment, feeling that same fatigue, what would you have done? Would you go? Would you go? Would you have stayed silent? That's the question people don't like answering out loud, because silence is never neutral in rooms like this. Silence is a choice. Applause is a choice. Booing, especially in a space that prides itself on civility, is a declaration. And declarations don't happen unless people feel justified. Think about the psychology for a moment. You're surrounded by peers, colleagues, rivals, people whose opinions you respect or fear. You're acutely aware that every reaction you have is being observed, logged, interpreted. In that environment, most people default to the safest response: polite approval. So when someone breaks from that default, it's rarely impulsive. It's usually the result of accumulated frustration meeting a moment that feels symbolic enough to carry it. That's why this question, who was in the crowd, matters more than how loud the boos were. Because the real power at Sundance isn't volume, it's credibility. And credibility that night felt fractured. Several attendees later described a strange disconnect between the official framing of the event and the conversations happening in line beforehand. People weren't buzzing about discovery. They weren't speculating about cinematic innovation. They were asking pointed questions. Why this film here? Why now? What does this say about the festival? Those questions don't come from trolls. They come from people who care enough to feel disappointed. One filmmaker described overhearing a conversation that stuck with them. It feels like we're being asked to clap for the idea of a story, not the story itself. That's a subtle critique, but a devastating one, because Sundance has always positioned itself as a place where stories earn their applause, where narratives are interrogated, not assumed, where authenticity matters more than access. And that's where the tension crystallized. For some in the crowd, this debut felt less like a creative risk and more like a branding exercise. Less like a question posed to the audience and more like a conclusion presented for endorsement. You can disagree with that interpretation. Many did. but you can't ignore how widely it circulated among people who were actually there. What's striking is how often the word disconnect comes up in post-event descriptions. A disconnect between message and medium, between intention and reception, between who the film was ostensibly for and who was actually in the room. And when disconnects pile up, they produce friction. Now, here's where things get even more uncomfortable. Because for some attendees, the reaction wasn't just about the documentary. It was about accumulation. About a sense that this appearance represented not a standalone moment, but a pattern. Patterns are powerful. They're what audiences react to more than individual acts. And once a pattern is perceived, fairly or unfairly, it frames everything that follows. Several festival regulars mentioned feeling like they'd seen this rollout before. Not this exact project, but the structure, the language, the positioning, the expectation of deference. When people feel they're being sold familiarity as novelty, resistance follows. That resistance doesn't always come out as anger. Sometimes it comes out as boredom, sometimes as irony, sometimes as refusal to participate. And sometimes, yes, it comes out as booze. What complicates this further is that Sundance audiences aren't monolithic in their values, but they are unified in their suspicion of anything that feels too managed. Management implies hierarchy. Hierarchy implies distance. Distance implies lack of vulnerability. And lack of vulnerability is the one thing Sundance has historically punished most harshly. So when the reaction turned uneven, it wasn't because the crowd suddenly became hostile. It was because the crowd became evaluative. They stopped playing their assigned role. And once that happens, the script unravels fast. You can see it in how defenders framed the moment afterward. Notice how quickly the narrative shifted from celebration to correction, from enthusiasm to damage control. It was exaggerated. It was only a few people. The majority were supportive. The footage was misleading. All of those statements may be true, but the urgency behind them tells a deeper story. Because if the crowd reaction truly aligned with expectations, there would have been no need to clarify, no need to reassure, no need to argue over decibel levels. People argue over meaning, not volume. And meaning was suddenly up for debate. Another detail worth paying attention to: who stayed quiet afterward. Some of the most influential voices in the room didn't rush to comment publicly at all. No glowing posts, no enthusiastic endorsements, no urgent defenses. Silence again. And in elite spaces, silence from the powerful speaks louder than boos from the margins. That silence suggested caution, distance, a wait-and-see posture, which raises an important point. For all the attention paid to the crowd, the real audience that night wasn't outside. It was inside the industry. And the industry watches moments like this differently. It looks past the noise and asks, what does this reveal about momentum? Momentum is everything. It's what determines whether doors open or quietly close, whether invitations multiply or dry up, whether a narrative continues forward or starts looping back on itself. From that perspective, the reaction at the premiere wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing, because it suggested that the narrative might be losing its frictionless glide. And friction is expensive. The irony is that Sundance audiences are famously forgiving of missteps. When they sense honesty, they'll sit through rough cuts. They'll engage with flawed projects. They'll debate loudly and passionately. What they resist is feeling managed. So when defenders framed the crowd as unfair or hostile, it only deepened the divide. Because many attendees didn't see themselves as antagonists. They saw themselves as participants who were no longer being invited into the conversation. One local put it bluntly, it felt like we were extras in someone else's moment. That sentiment, being used as a backdrop rather than engaged as an audience, is poison in a space built on mutual respect. And that's why the question of who was in the crowd keeps circling back. Because it wasn't outsiders rejecting the moment, it was insiders questioning it. People who understand the culture, who know the rules, who usually play along. And when those people hesitate, the entire ecosystem notices. The next day, conversations in shuttle vans and coffee lines reportedly shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just differently. Less excitement, more analysis, more skepticism. People weren't talking about the film's themes as much as they were talking about the reaction to its debut. That alone tells you the debut failed to control the narrative. And once the narrative escapes, it doesn't come back easily. What's fascinating is how many people described feeling conflicted. They didn't want to dislike the moment. They didn't arrive intending to reject it. But intention doesn't always survive experience. And experience that night was messy. That messiness is what made it newsworthy, because a clean success wouldn't have sparked this level of debate, and a clean failure would have been dismissed. This liminal space between applause and rejection is far more dangerous. It invites interpretation, and interpretation invites polarization, which is exactly what happened next. As clips spread and accounts clashed, the crowd itself became a battleground. People arguing not just about what happened, but about who counts as a legitimate audience. Fans accused critics of elitism. Critics accused fans of blind loyalty. Locals accused outsiders of hijacking the festival. Outsiders accused locals of gatekeeping. In other words, the crowd fractured publicly the same way it had fractured in real time. And that fracture revealed something deeper than a bad night. It revealed a moment when alignment broke between message and medium, between storytellers and audience, between expectation. That's why this chapter matters, because until you understand who was standing there and what they felt, you can't understand why the next phase unfolded the way it did. And the next phase didn't happen on a carpet. It happened in the shadows, in back hallways, in late-night calls, in carefully worded messages sent and unsent, because once the crowd speaks, even imperfectly, the people in charge have to decide how to respond. Do they lean in, or do they retreat? That decision, made quietly after the noise faded, would shape everything that followed, and the consequences of that decision were about to become impossible to ignore. Why was this film always going to be a gamble? Because some projects don't just ask to be watched, they ask to be believed. And belief is a much higher bar than applause. Cookie Queens wasn't positioned as a quiet indie experiment. It wasn't framed as a modest creative risk. From the moment it was announced, it carried weight. Expectation, symbolism. It arrived with context already attached to it, whether anyone wanted that or not. That context walked onto the red carpet before the filmmakers did. This is where a lot of people misunderstand what went wrong that night. They focus on the reaction without interrogating the setup. But in storytelling, especially at Sundance, setup is everything. You can get away with almost anything if the audience feels invited. You can get away with almost nothing if they feel instructed. And this project, fairly or unfairly, walked into the room carrying instructions. Think about the way it was framed in advance. Not just as a documentary, but as a statement. Not just as a story, but as a continuation of a narrative arc that audiences had already been following. Sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, for years. By the time people lined up outside the venue, they didn't feel like they were about to discover something unknown. They felt like they were about to be asked to affirm something familiar. And familiarity cuts both ways. On one hand, it brings built-in attention. On the other, it brings baggage, assumptions, fatigue, expectations that can't be reset once they're formed. Several attendees described this exact tension. They didn't come in hostile. They came in wary of being positioned as witnesses to a victory lap rather than participants in a conversation. That wariness matters, because Sundance audiences are particularly sensitive to tone. They don't just evaluate content, they evaluate posture. Is the film curious, or is it declarative? Is it exploratory, or is it conclusive? Is it asking questions, or delivering answers? The perception, again, perception, not intent, was that Cookie Queens arrived with its answers already polished. That's not inherently bad. Plenty of documentaries do that successfully. But it becomes risky when the audience feels those answers are meant to be received, not challenged, especially in a cultural moment defined by skepticism. Here's the contradiction that sat at the center of this debut. The documentary positioned itself as a celebration of voice, agency, and empowerment, yet the rollout felt controlled. managed, carefully orchestrated. Those two things don't always sit comfortably together. Audiences can tolerate polish. What they resist is feeling managed, while being told the story is about authenticity. That tension doesn't explode immediately. It simmers, and then it finds a moment. For some in the crowd, that moment came the second the red carpet began to feel less like a premiere and more like a performance. Not a performance in the artistic sense, but in the branding sense. One filmmaker put it this way: it felt like the documentary was already a product before anyone had seen it. That perception, again, whether fair or not, was lethal in a space that prides itself on discovery. Sundance has always rewarded vulnerability, even messy vulnerability, especially messy vulnerability. Films that arrive incomplete, questions unresolved, edges rough. Cookie Queens arrived complete, confident, sealed. And sealed stories are harder to enter. This is where timing becomes crucial. Had this film debuted in a different era, before the current wave of cultural exhaustion, it might have been received very differently. But audiences now are hypersensitive to repetition, to perceived self-mythologizing, to narratives that feel immune to critique. In that environment, a documentary that appears to reinforce an existing brand identity is walking on thin ice. Some attendees admitted they felt conflicted before the screening even began. They wanted to be moved. They wanted to engage. Buddy also worried they were about to be told how to feel. That's a dangerous place to start, because once an audience feels preempted, it looks for cracks. And cracks are exactly what people began to scrutinize, not just in the film, but in the framing of the premiere itself. Why Sundance? That question came up repeatedly. Sundance is more than a festival. It's a symbol, a stamp of cultural legitimacy, a place where projects seek validation from a community that prides itself on independence. Choosing Sundance signaled ambition. It also raised expectations. If you bring a project here, you're implicitly saying it can withstand scrutiny, that it belongs in a space where nothing is taken at face value. Some audience members felt that expectation wasn't met, not because the film lacked merit, but because it felt insulated from challenge. Insulation reads as insecurity to skeptical crowds, and skepticism is Sundance's native language. This is why the reaction on the carpet can't be separated from the documentary itself. The boos weren't just about presence, they were about positioning. A few attendees later admitted something surprising. They hadn't planned to react at all. They expected to stand, watch, clap politely, and move on. But when the moment arrived, something felt off. The celebration felt premature. The applause felt assumed. An assumption is something Sundance audiences push back against instinctively. One longtime critic described the mood succinctly. It felt like the film wanted credit for the conversation before the conversation had happened. That sentiment, once voiced, spread quickly, and when it spread, it reframed the entire night. Because suddenly, the reaction wasn't about liking or disliking a documentary. It was about resisting a dynamic, the dynamic where audiences are cast as validators rather than participants. Now, to be fair, not everyone saw it this way. Plenty of people were genuinely excited. Plenty were moved. Plenty felt the backlash was unfair or opportunistic. But here's the thing about divided reactions. They don't neutralize each other. They heighten stakes. Once a project becomes polarizing, every moment is read through that lens. Every gesture is scrutinized. Every response is amplified. And that's exactly what happened. Even supporters began defending not just the film, but the right of the film to be there, to exist in that space. To be celebrated, that's a subtle but important shift. When you're defending the right to exist, rather than the content itself, something has already gone sideways. Another layer that complicated this gamble was expectation management. The promotional language leading up to the premiere leaned heavily on impact, on importance, on relevance. Those are powerful claims. They also invite challenge. When you tell an audience something matters deeply, they will test that claim. Especially an audience trained to interrogate significance. And interrogation doesn't always look polite. Sometimes it looks like withholding applause. Sometimes it looks like asking questions that make publicists nervous. And sometimes, yes, it looks like booze breaking through a red carpet routine. What's crucial to understand is that Sundance audiences don't see themselves as consumers. They see themselves as custodians of a cultural space. They feel responsible for guarding its identity. So when something arrives that feels out of sync with that identity, the reaction isn't passive. It's corrective. That's why the word risk keeps surfacing in conversations about this debut. Not because the film was daring, but because the venue was unforgiving. This was a bet that the project's narrative power would override audience skepticism. For some, it did. For others, it backfired. And that split reaction was enough to destabilize the moment. Because from that point on, everything became reactive. The film wasn't just being watched. It was being evaluated as a symbol of where Sundance was headed, a symbol of celebrity influence, a symbol of how cultural capital is allocated. Those are heavy burdens for any documentary to carry, especially on opening night. One attendee captured the mood perfectly. It felt like the film was on trial before it even started. That's not a fair position for any project, but fairness and reality don't always align. And reality that night was shaped by perception, timing, and accumulated tension. The gamble wasn't that people would dislike the film. The gamble was that they would resent being asked to receive it a certain way. And resentment, once triggered, is loud. As the screening approached, the energy shifted again. The outdoor noise faded. People filed inside. Seats filled. Lights dimmed. On the surface, things returned to normal. But beneath that surface, the atmosphere had changed. People weren't settling in with open minds. They were settling in with expectations sharpened by the moment outside. Every scene would be read through that lens. Every message weighed against the reaction that preceded it. And that meant the film was no longer just a film. It was a referendum on credibility, on narrative control, on whether this story could hold its ground without the protection of applause. The question hanging in the air as the screen flickered to life was simple and brutal. Could Cookie Queens win over a room that had already signaled doubt? Because if it couldn't, then the gamble wouldn't just fail. It would echo. And that echo would follow far beyond Sundance. What was the exact moment everything crossed the line? Because up until then, there was still deniability, still plausible confusion, still the option to say, maybe we imagined it, maybe it was nothing. That option disappeared the second a voice cut through the noise clearly enough for people to look at one another and think, did you hear that too? That's how witnesses describe the first heckle. Not loud enough to dominate the space. Not crude enough to be immediately shut down, just sharp enough to break the illusion. A sentence, not a chant. And that distinction matters. Chants are coordinated. Sentences are personal. According to multiple attendees, it happened just as the arrivals paused for photographs. The kind of pause that invites reaction. Cameras fixed, smiles held. That suspended second, where the crowd decides what kind of moment this will be. Instead of a roar, there was hesitation, and then the voice. Some say it came from the left side of the barricade, others swear it was behind the press line. A few claim it echoed from farther back, bouncing oddly off the surrounding buildings. No one agrees on the exact location. Everyone agrees on the effect. Heads turned. Smiles tightened. A few people laughed nervously, unsure whether the sound was meant as a joke or a jab. Applause tried to recover, clapping louder, faster, as if volume could smooth over tension. It didn't. Because once one voice breaks protocol, others feel emboldened. That's when the second reaction came. Not identical to the first. Different tone. Different phrasing. Enough to confirm this wasn't a fluke. This was feedback. Have you ever watched a crowd realize, collectively, that the rules have changed? It doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks like confusion. People glancing around to see how others are reacting. Checking for cues, waiting for security to intervene. Security didn't. And that hesitation sent its own message. Because when nothing happens, people interpret it as permission. That's when the sound spread. Not into a chorus. Not into chaos, but into something far more destabilizing. A pattern, a voice here, Another there. Enough spacing between them that you couldn't isolate the source. Enough frequency that you couldn't pretend it was accidental. Some attendees describe the noise as heckling rather than booing. Others insist it was unmistakable booing. The argument itself reveals how unusual the moment was. Normally, people don't debate whether a crowd reacted negatively. It's obvious. Here, the ambiguity became part of the story. But what really changed everything wasn't the sound. It was the response. Or rather, the lack of one. There was no attempt to engage, no wave to reset the mood, no pause to absorb and redirect. Instead, movements tightened. The pace quickened, handlers stepped closer. That reaction spoke volumes, because experienced public figures know how to neutralize hecklers. Humor, confidence, acknowledgement, even defiance. What they don't usually do is ignore it entirely, unless they're trying to make it disappear. Ignoring only works when the crowd follows suit. This crowd didn't. And that's when the cameras became a problem. You could see it in how operators adjusted framing. Tight close-ups instead of wide shots. Less crowd. More faces. Less context. That's not accidental. Wide shots tell stories, tight shots control them. People who have worked red carpets for years noticed the shift immediately. One described it as the camera equivalent of closing a door. And closing doors mid-moment always raises suspicion. As the arrivals moved along, the reactions followed, muted but persistent. Not escalating, not dying out. Just there, like static. What's interesting is how quickly the mood flipped from spectacle to discomfort. Red carpets thrive on excess, on indulgence, on lingering in the glow. This one became transactional. Smile, click, move. Smile, click, move. That rhythm tells you everything. One observer noted that questions from the press were cut shorter than expected. Another noticed a handler physically repositioning someone to block the line of sight from a particularly vocal section of the crowd. Small moves, big implications. Because if everything is going well, you don't need to manage sight lines. That's when the narrative began splitting in real time. Supporters near the front clapped harder, louder, almost defiantly. Critics further back reacted audibly. The space between them filled with tension. It wasn't a hostile crowd. It was a divided one, and division is more dangerous than opposition. Opposition unites. Division destabilizes. As the moment stretched on, the arrival wrapped faster than anticipated. No dramatic exit. No triumphant final wave. Just movement. Inside, the reaction continued, but differently. People carried the energy with them through doors, into lobbies, into lines, for seats. Conversations picked up immediately, buzzing with questions rather than excitement. Did you hear that? Was that planned? What just happened? Those questions traveled faster than any official narrative. And that's where the story escaped the carpet entirely. Because the first heckle wasn't the climax, it was the spark. The real damage happened in the seconds after, when the response failed to reset the room. When people realized there would be no acknowledgement, no confrontation, no explanation, only continuation. And continuation in the face of visible tension reads as denial. One attendee later said something telling. It felt like everyone pretended nothing happened, and that made it worse. That's the paradox of public moments. Addressing discomfort can diffuse it. Ignoring it amplifies it. As the screening approached, the question wasn't whether the crowd had reacted negatively. The question was how the film would now be received under that cloud. Because first impressions don't just color perception. They frame it. Every scene on screen would now be read as a response to what happened outside, even if it wasn't intended that way. That's the danger of a disrupted debut. It doesn't just affect the moment. It rewrites the context, and the context had just shifted from celebration to scrutiny. As the lights dimmed and the room settled, there was a palpable sense of evaluation. Not hostility, not excitement, judgment. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits and waits. Because if the red carpet had raised questions, the screening was about to answer them, whether it wanted to or not. What no one outside the room could see was that inside, the stakes had doubled. This was no longer just a premiere. It was a test, and the outcome of that test would determine whether the heckle would be remembered as an anomaly or as a warning. What happened once the doors closed? That's where the story stops being loud and starts being dangerous, because backstage is where narratives either stabilize or collapse. It's where smiles drop, where phones come out, where people stop performing and start calculating. And according to multiple people who were there, the atmosphere behind the scenes that night was nothing like the one being projected outside. The first thing to understand is this: confusion spread faster than outrage. There wasn't a meltdown. There wasn't shouting. There wasn't a dramatic confrontation. What there was disbelief. People asking the same question over and over in hushed tones. Did that really just happen? Not in a rhetorical way, in a logistical way. As in, how do we handle this? Handlers exchanged looks that said more than words. Publicists checked their phones compulsively, refreshing feeds that were already filling with conflicting clips and captions. Assistants leaned in close, whispering updates that came in fragments. The problem wasn't that something went wrong. The problem was that no one agreed on how wrong it was. Some insisted it was minor, a blip, something that could be drowned out with the right framing. Others were visibly rattled, already thinking several steps ahead. Because in moments like this, the first narrative that sticks becomes the truth, regardless of accuracy. And that narrative was already slipping out of their hands. One person who moved between spaces that night described the mood as split screen. In one room, people were trying to carry on as planned, reminding each other that the screening itself was what mattered. In another, people were quietly scrambling, trying to assess damage. Those two realities did not reconcile. That's when the conflicting accounts began. Inside the venue, some attendees reported polite applause as the screening began. Others noticed a conspicuous lack of enthusiasm, not hostility, just restraint. No standing ovation energy. No buzzed anticipation. People sat back, arms crossed, notebooks open, minds already made up, or at least primed to judge. Outside, meanwhile, the story was mutating online. Clips were being reposted with dramatically different captions. One described a hostile crowd, another insisted supporters drowned out a few hecklers. Audio was boosted, then disputed, then boosted again. What's telling is how quickly the focus shifted from the film to the reaction. That's never a good sign. When a premiere goes well, people argue about themes, scenes, performances. When it doesn't, they argue about tone, reception, and intent. And backstage, that shift was already being felt. One staffer recalled overhearing someone say, "We need to get ahead of this, not about the documentary, about the moment." That sentence alone reveals where the anxiety was centered. Because if the film were unquestionably strong in that room, the reaction outside would have faded. Instead, it lingered, because insiders weren't confident the screaming would override it. Now, here's where the contradictions deepen. Some people inside genuinely believed the audience was receptive. They pointed to applause at the end, to attentive silence during key moments, to post-screening conversations that were thoughtful rather than dismissive. Others, just a few steps away, read the same signals differently. They noticed who wasn't clapping, who left early, who avoided eye contact afterward, who didn't linger to discuss. And those absences mattered. Because influence at festivals isn't always vocal, it's often invisible. The people whose reactions shape outcomes are rarely the loudest. They're the ones others quietly watch. And several of those people, according to multiple accounts, were non-committal at best. No effusive praise, no urgent endorsements, just neutral nods. Carefully chosen words. That neutrality sent a chill through backstage conversations. Because neutrality, in moments like this, is not safety. It's delay. Delay means uncertainty. Uncertainty means risk. And risk is the one thing everyone was suddenly trying to manage. This is where the narrative fractured irreparably. Public-facing statements would later emphasize positivity, focus on the work, highlight supportive reactions. Privately, the tone was far more cautious. One insider described the atmosphere as walking on glass. Every word measured. Every reaction weighed. no one wanting to be the person who overreacted or underreacted. That paralysis is deadly in crisis moments, because while you hesitate, the story doesn't. It moves, it mutates, it gets simplified into something easier to digest than the truth. And that simplification had already begun. Online, the reaction was being reduced to binaries: love or hate, support or backlash, success or failure. Backstage, people knew the reality was messier. But messy doesn't travel well. Clean narratives do. And the clean narrative forming was not favorable. What made things worse was the lack of a single authoritative account. Normally, in high-profile situations, someone steps in to anchor the story. A clear statement, a definitive tone, something that says, this is what happened, and this is how you should understand it. That didn't happen immediately. Instead, there was hesitation. Internal debate: do we acknowledge the reaction or ignore it? Do we frame it as minor dissent or highlight the support? Do we respond quickly or wait for it to blow over? Each option carried risk. Acknowledging it could amplify it. Ignoring it could look evasive.